You probably have heard of the term zero-tariff policy, and you're justifiably asking, what exactly does this mean for me as an investor, as a trader, as a business person, especially in the context of a trade relationship between African economies and China worth over $300 billion a year? We'll get into the details of that in this program, but first, let's start with some background.
In the summer of 2025, China announced the expansion of its preferential access for African nations, extending its zero-tariff policy for least developed countries to encompass all African countries with diplomatic ties to Beijing. Now, the policy eliminates all tariffs on Chinese imports originating from Africa, a measure that, in principle, could deepen economic ties between China and Africa by granting African exports greater access to a market of 1.4 billion people. Implementing the zero-tariff policy means the removal of all taxes on nearly all goods, and that ranges from agricultural produce like coffee, tea, macadamia nuts, chocolate, and so on, to minerals and textiles and manufactured items. This development isn't just a diplomatic gesture. It reflects a strategic recalibration that's looking to balance China's significant trade surplus with Africa while opening up new export opportunities for African nations.
It's a very important opportunity for Africa. China is the biggest market in the world, very lucrative market, very vibrant, and to be able to access that market, I think is going to be extremely important for our industrialization in Africa, for our modernization efforts, but also for us to improve efficiency and effectiveness in our business models and production systems.
Pour le Maroc, bien sûr, c'est une offre intéressante et nous espérons qu'à travers cette généreuse offre de la Chine, que l'on pourrait augmenter le volume des exportations marocaines vers la Chine. Le marché chinois est un marché immense. Je pensais que les exportateurs marocains souhaitent également pouvoir pénétrer ce marché dans un certain nombre de créneaux. Nous pensons aux produits agricoles, produits agro-industriels, produits transformés. Nous pensons aux produits de la mer.
As such, it could potentially catalyze economic transformation, provided that African countries align policies and build capacity that fully leverages this opening up by continuing to push forward the negotiation and signing of agreements in economic partnership for shared development, and further expand access for African exports to China by upgrading the Green Channel, among other measures. That means that beyond just tariff reduction, China has implemented many other non-tariff trade policies to enhance Sino-African trade. That includes trade finance policies, trade platform policies, and the Green Channel policy. The Green Channel policy has stood out as one of the most consequential platforms for breaking barriers to trade between Africa and Beijing. In 2021, China declared it would establish the Green Channel for African agricultural products. Under this policy, there are three core measures towards trade acceleration: priority access processing, combined risk assessment, and flexible enterprise registration.
Many agriculture companies in Kenya have appreciated that effort of a China free trade, simply because we're able to get better pricing from our exporters and our business partners in China. We're getting more inquiries if we can partner with Chinese state corporation companies to do the export of avocado. We can expect, if we do a duration of around 12 months, there's going to be an increase of maybe close to 50% of exports, agriculture exports to China.
Once this policy came into effect, 16 agricultural products from 11 African countries had gained access to China under the Green Channel policy by June 2023. This zero-tariff arrangement is unilateral, so it is a special preferential tariff. In February this year, China reached framework agreements with South Africa, and in March, Beijing penned an early harvest arrangement with Kenya, as well as a framework agreement with Nigeria.
The relationship has grown into one of Kenya's most important economic partnerships, spanning trade, infrastructure development, manufacturing cooperation, technology exchange, and people-to-people engagement.
It is also a time of great opportunity for our continent and indeed for our country as well. Global economic uncertainties climate risks and shifting trade patterns underscore the need for building economic resilience and capability, diversifying both our export basket and our exporter base is in the end key to our economic growth strategy.
In order for us to gain more access to the Chinese market, I think it will accelerate the industrialization process in our country and also Africa in general.
Ceci dit, le Bénin est un pays agricole. 25% du PIB de notre économie provient du secteur agricole. Et donc c'est une aubaine extraordinaire qui nous est accordée pour effectivement augmenter le volume de nos exportations agricoles vers la Chine. Il y a effectivement un enthousiasme auprès des producteurs béninois.
And while the zero-tariff policy appears in favor of increasing African exports to China, the story is not as straightforward. China is foregoing about $1.4 billion in tariff revenue under this expanded scheme. But improving trade obviously will take a lot more than just zero tariffs alone. Africa needs economic restructuring, industrial upgrading, and supply chain transformation. This policy should facilitate capacity building and long-term economic growth based on industrialization and digitization. Otherwise, it will just deepen Africa's status as a supplier of raw materials without moving up the value chain. It should be treated as an opportunity to optimize resource allocation to improve Africa's hardware and software infrastructure for structural transformation and long-term growth.
To give you a sense of the sort of capital goods that tend to be imported from China, look no further than where we are at the moment. Big chunk of the steel that is in this particular warehouse, it's coming in from producers, from foundries over in China. And it goes beyond that. The crane and the equipment that went to building this factory from Chinese manufacturers, and the steel is being offloaded from a truck from a Chinese manufacturer. And that gives you a sense of the depth, of the nuance, of the sort of imports that are coming into the African continent from China. If countries and economies are going to move up the value chain, this is the foundational layer.
We have a motive or intention to make East Africa free of importation, especially in the infrastructure product, which is steel and cement. And that's where we are expanding. We are a very good partner with China, as we import most of our machinery from them, the government companies of China. We import our steel and cement, most of the percentage, 90% machinery comes from China. We have imported last 2 years' times over $2 billion machinery for East Africa. And that is what is our main core business is.
How do you see this policy working out? Because when China's government shows up and says we're going to remove the tariff barriers to pretty much any imports coming out of African economies coming into China, what was your first impression when you heard that?
It is a great step and a very big opportunity for the Africa to grow, for Kenya to grow, for East Africa to grow in industrializations, in agriculture, in medicine, in many technology, because we will be able to get a good support from China to set up the industries here. Actually what they require and what they import can be set up a very good production unit in Kenya and export to China, which will benefit both sides, because we will be importing the Chinese machinery, technology, know-how, and also we will be able to sell that to that market, because China is one of the largest market after America, is 1.3 billion people, and then followed by India. So it will help us to not only to export to China, but also that technology will be able to support us to achieve our dream for the industrialization for the country, creating the jobs for our Kenyans and Africans in our units here.
Do you think there'll be a lot more of that, a lot more reshoring, for lack of a better word, moving manufacturing, some manufacturing work from China into economies in Africa?
It can be a very big step if it is taken seriously by the also African government. Let's say if I talk about the Kenya, if it is taken very seriously, and it is the law made for the investors very long term, then it is a very big project, because very big policy, because we can be an industrial hub in next 5 years' time if our government puts a stable policy of the investors. Today, the policy keeps on changing every now and then. Today there's policy, tomorrow it is changed. So no investor gets the confidence whether I put my project or not.
A lot of countries say they want to move up the value chain, right? We want to stop exporting raw materials, want to export more finished goods, more processed goods. What do we need to do to make sure that we have an effective skills transfer from China as part of this zero tariff policy?
Africa has got all the minerals. Other countries don't have. They have, but some they have, some they don't. For example, I give you one example, that the largest mineral which Kenya found recently is called coltan, which is available now after the research in Kenya. Now coltan is made for what? The coltan mineral you can make out of that is a semiconductor. And the semiconductor is the biggest game in the world. Today,
and the DRC produces a lot of it.
DRC produces the coltan, Rwanda produces coltan, and we will be producing coltan Kenya. But if we export the ore, then there is no use of it. That coltan is $300 a kilo. Now the same coltan, if you convert into the semiconductor, it will be one small chip will be $2,000, which will be maybe 20 grams. So that industry can be put in Kenya, and Kenya can earn the foreign exchange. Minimum 500,000 people will get the job. There is no job in the country. Why? In Africa, not in Kenya only. It's because we are not be able to fetch this kind of industry. That kind of industry needs more than a couple of $1 billion investment. You need partnership with the government of China or any other who can give you their know-how and can be partner to produce that. Now, if we take this all kind of thing, this $2 billion to produce semiconductor is a very small investment, I'm telling you, in a small scale. If it is big, then it has to be much bigger. If we put such, it is just one example I'm giving you, but if we fetch this kind of industry and pass it into the parliament that this law will not be changed for 25 years, many investors will come.
China's zero-tariff policy is part of a larger effort under the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, better known to you and I as FOCAC. It's a multilateral coordination mechanism between African economies on one hand and China on the other. It expands previous trade preferences limited to least developed countries to now include middle-income economies like Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. The policy is expected to cover over 98% of taxable items originating from 53 African countries. That includes staple exports like coffee, tea, cotton, seafood, iron ore, metal ores of various sorts, and processed goods. In return, African countries are expected to support trade facilitation and align standards with international best practices.
It is also an answer to unilateralism and protectionism. That show South Africa and China hand in hand to open wider both their market to each other so that they can enhance our bilateral relations.
Africa remains China's fastest growing trading partner, with 2025 export value estimated at $365 billion. That represents the fastest growth rate of all regions at about 18%. But that export growth has earned the continent just 5.5% of China's market, compared to Asia's 52%, Europe's 19%, North America's 10%, and Latin America's 8%. This represents more than $107 billion in trade surplus in the 12-month period, meaning China needs to import more from Africa in order to reduce that surplus. China's top exports to Africa include water vessels like cruise ships, excursion and ferry boats, cargo ships, telephone sets, and includes, of course, smartphones and other cell phones for cellular networks, motor vehicles, woven fabrics of synthetic filament yarn. On the flip side, Beijing's top imports from Africa are mainly raw and semi-refined mineral resources like petroleum oils, refined copper and copper alloys, aluminium ores and concentrates, gold, and that includes gold plated with platinum, as well as iron ores and concentrates.
In the second part of this special episode, we'll explore exactly what the benefits of the zero-tariff policy are, not just for African economies, but for Chinese businesses and investors as well.
China's new universal zero-tariff policy is a step in that direction, in that it equalizes tariff treatment across countries and hence regional groupings. This empowers cross-country cooperation in investment for export production to China. This also feeds into Africa's own regional integration and trade agenda under the African Continental Free Trade Area. For years, high import duties and opaque valuation practices have hindered trade across much of the continent. This now calls for what is technically referred to as trade facilitation. It's essentially the process by which customs procedures, including inspection and so on, are simplified. It's designed to maximize economic impact by reducing non-tariff barriers like complex customs procedures, high logistics costs, and stringent quality standards. In effect, trade facilitation helps to transform nominal tariff savings into actual trade volumes by making African products competitive in China's market.
A lot of time we lost opportunities due to high cost of exportation and processing systems. But with the inception or incoming of the zero tariff from the China, I think it's a very good advantage for us to utilize it, whereas we need government support in order to meet up the requirement for exports.
As we explained earlier, China is offering elevated trade facilitation support. Examples include an upgrading of the green channel. Green lanes effectively allow streamlined inspection and quarantine, whereas customs clearances can include simplified documentation, faster phytosanitary checks, and priority processing at ports. Incentivizing value-added exports is a key opportunity. Countries like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, for example, they produce large volumes of raw cocoa. They're the largest producers of that commodity anywhere in the world. Now they have an opportunity to build domestic processing capacity and to export chocolate products instead of unprocessed beans. Moreover, textile and apparel industries in countries like Lesotho, Kenya and Ethiopia could benefit significantly if backed by policies that enhance logistics, quality control and branding. Another significant benefit of the Zero Tariff Initiative is the removal of cost barriers. African exporters can now sell goods in China at more competitive prices, unlocking new markets for agricultural and manufactured goods. For example, Kenya's avocado exports to China rose by 28% in 2024 following partial tariff relief. With tariffs now fully eliminated, this trend is expected to accelerate. Likewise, Ethiopia's coffee sector, already prominent in China's specialty market, could see a surge in demand. Small and medium-sized enterprises and farmer cooperatives can now participate more actively in international trade. With the right training, certifications and logistic support, Africa's informal sector could access China's $17 trillion consumer economy, giving rural economies a shot in the arm in their development prospects. China's top 5 trading partners in Africa in 2025 are South Africa, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, and Egypt. But here's why the zero-tariff policy really matters for China-Africa trade. The 20 non-least developed countries, or LDCs, as ranked by the Balance of Trade measure, account for over 45% of China's imports. 5 of those make up more than 27% of that trade surplus, and that includes Nigeria, Liberia, Egypt, Algeria, and Kenya. There is, nonetheless, a risk that consistent tariff treatment simply facilitates the continent's strong economies and export prospects, such as Morocco, Egypt and South Africa, where economies like Kenya and Ghana may benefit to some extent, there's a risk that LDCs gain the least or perhaps even get squeezed.
It is the question of regional value chains. So small African countries like Mozambique, Malawi will be able to benefit from this when they link up with South Africa. South Africa now will be a market for Malawi and Mozambique. They can export their products to South Africa, and then the case for South Africa, it can also now invest in Mozambique, and the chain goes. It's a question of regional value chains.
So that's what we need to be thinking about, building regional industrial clusters rather than thinking about it just in strictly country level terms.
Yes.
How fast might we start seeing the benefits of this zero tariff policy taking effect? Because yes, if you're dropping tariffs on agricultural exports, right, from an average of 14% down to zero, does that then translate into more earnings for farmers and aggregators immediately?
Well, for how fast we start reaping the benefits, that depends on African governments. It is a case of policy response. So how well and how fast will African governments harness this kind of commitment? So how much time depends on how willing and how open African governments are able to sit and understand this and negotiate this together.
What sort of support measures do governments need to put in place to enable firms in Africa to export into the Chinese market? Because the tariffs are out now, but the bigger hurdle is meeting standards required in the Chinese market, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very true. We need to understand and treat trade barriers as opportunities of how we can come out best of the troubles we are in today. So it's a question of compliance. How are we sorting our manufacturing? How are we doing our logistics? So when we understand those kind of aspects, then we can be able to come out of this very, very fast. Yeah.
That being said, in the third part of this special episode, we'll be exploring what exactly needs to happen to make sure that the zero tariff policy works for both sides.
The successful implementation of this policy has a wide range of benefits, not just to African exporters, but also for the Chinese market. At a macroeconomic level, the impact is pretty direct. From lower import prices to higher import volumes, the zero tariff policy between China and Africa should help to increase the competitiveness of Chinese firms who are seeking to invest in African production and manufacturing value chains. It should help to expand the choice available to consumers in China, especially in agricultural products like tea, coffee and avocado, thereby improving the diversification and security of supply for China's imports.
I think it's like a milestone for transforming, because before our Chinese, most business people, they import from China and sell in Kenya market. It's a one-way trade. But today, with the new policy, this 100% zero tariff, now the story will be changed. So in the future, we'll find more and more people will export from Kenya to China. Before, maybe we export the raw materials. Today, even the finished products also enjoy the zero tariff. So you find more and more Chinese investors will use Chinese machinery, Chinese capital to settle down, set up the assemble factories in Kenya, especially like deep agro processing products, also even text products, even leather, even other products.
If fresh African fruits and foods are price competitive and offer us alternatives to local products, I'd be happy to try them. I think this policy is beneficial for both sides. Chinese consumers will have more choices.
China and African countries have friendly relations, and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is held annually. This zero-tariff policy further facilitates the export of African products and promotes bilateral trade.
After African products enter the Chinese market, I will be buying coffee beans. I drink 2 or 3 cups of coffee every day, and African coffee beans will be very popular. This policy will help further exchanges and cooperation between China and African countries.
I have high hopes for agricultural products such as coffee, cocoa, and fruit. Any policy that benefits our daily lives is good, making our lives more convenient and affordable.
We can try African decorative items such as handicrafts. This policy is especially timely for consumers like us. For someone like me who enjoys shopping, being able to buy better products at lower prices is ideal.
From an African perspective, exporters are poised to benefit from higher export prices and volumes, allowing for a lot more balanced trade with China by none least developed countries. It is therefore an opportunity for African countries to explore more export products and to diversify from the mining sector, which accounted for 80% of exports in 2025. This policy reduces more tariffs on agricultural products than on any other product category. The agricultural product tariff reduction is 14%, while those of non-agricultural products is around 6.5%.
Let's address some of the concerns that come along with this zero-tariff policy. First, will the trade balance actually improve? In 2025, Africa's trade deficit with China went up by 65%. And some do worry that this policy will encourage even more Chinese industrial goods to come into the African market, deepening its trade deficit with China. Manufactured goods and agricultural exports do need to satisfy some standards to get access to the Chinese market, specifically sanitary and phytosanitary standards. You'll hear those being referred to as SPS, and other technical regulations too. Both are permissible under the World Trade Organization rules, and often they're viewed as non-tariff barriers. And that leads us to our second question. How can these non-tariff barriers be overcome? Well, the concern here is that some African exporters may or may not be able to meet the product standards set for the Chinese market, and therefore they will fail to benefit from this policy. Third, is this a means of creating economic dependence on China? Critics have also argued that zero tariffs might make African economies a lot more dependent on the world's second largest economy, turning the continent essentially into a permanent supplier of raw materials and a dumping ground for Chinese manufactured goods. But in order to get answers to these questions, let's take a step back. Prior to the summer of 2025, when China announced the expansion of its preferential access to 53 African nations with diplomatic relations with China starting from the 1st of May 2026, only 33 least developed countries benefited from this arrangement. Trade between China and these LDCs accounts for 40% of China's total trade volume with the African continent, 31% of China's exports to Africa, and more than half of China's imports from Africa. Until now, the balance of trade with the 33 LDCs has amounted to a relatively small portion of the trade surplus, less than 2.2% of the total. And that, some would say, is the case for this zero-tariff policy.
In my opinion, what China is doing is offering Africans an opportunity to lay the ground to recalibrate their private sector. And secondly, there's the aspect where I would say, again, if we use biological terms, the restructuring of the DNA of our business structure. And what that means is that we are coming from a colonial model that was largely extractive. You notice I'm emphasizing African side because the challenge in Africa is more structural, and this structure is basically designed by who we trade with. So the way we've been trading mostly with the Western countries has been to simply export the raw materials, and here China comes to say, okay, we can give you unconditional zero tariff access So the term here is unconditional. We've had possibilities of conditional access. For example, AGOA with the US, where they would say you must be democratic before you access our markets, and maybe also the same for European Union. But a country giving you unconditional access is actually challenging you or challenging Africa. Rethink your structure.
You've led me into my next question quite neatly, because I know inevitably when this policy does go live on the 1st of May, the comparison will be China has a zero-tariff policy, and the comparison that will come to mind for a lot of countries is AGOA. Right. So walk us through that comparison. AGOA on one hand and China's zero-tariff policy on the other. You've already mentioned the unconditionality of it. What else makes them different?
China is emphasizing on high-quality kind of growth. High-quality growth means they are focusing mostly on high-tech. And high-tech here means they'll need minerals to power those drones that they are building, the aerospace activities they are engaging in.
Or even the electric vehicles that we're seeing at the Beijing Auto Show.
Energy storage. So you see, that's high-quality growth. So Africa is given zero-tariff access, and here is a country that's offering you zero-tariff access, but it's moved to another layer of economic development, high quality. If the countries do not strategically have a diplomatic ask to China, let us hitch our wagon to your growth. What do I mean by this? We need technical skills, because you are not going then to take advantage of the zero-tariff access if your skill set is still dominated by the extractive mindset, that we simply dig the stones out of the soil and then take it out. So it means we have to strategically make a big ask and say, let's align the zero-tariff access with strategic skilling, so that then the value add can be done.
So that's essentially the technical skills we need in manufacturing, in industry, in tech. All of those things have to be negotiated.
High quality, to align with the high quality growth. Because if not, then we remain with our traditional SME agro-processing, which China already, in its 5-year plan, is already showing that they are well beyond that. Of course, they will take some of those products. The other aspect would be to look at Africans who stay in China, because they have been sort of the agents of import-export aspect in terms of SME, and how do we leverage that and get some of them maybe coming back to strategically inform what I'll call the joint venture approach, so that then they grow to a certain medium scale of processing, because we know when it comes to critical minerals, that's really high level. It needs highly specialized approaches, but we could pitch for the medium level approach.
One last question for you. If we have this conversation in 5 years' time, let's take the medium term view, what's the optimist's case, the optimist argument for how African countries can make the most of this trade window that is now opened?
I think the most optimistic case for Africa is, from where I sit, is taking advantage of renewed interest in what I call the critical minerals. Because now it means China is creating a possibility for Africans to create a critical minerals corridor. And for me, that's very optimistic, but only if we think through strategically. Because we know now all powers want access to these minerals, and China is saying, okay, zero tariff means I could relocate maybe part of my processing to your side. Let's have a deal. So I think away from the traditional agricultural exports, I think China is giving us a possibility to create a critical minerals corridor for the global market.
In the final part of this special episode, we'll be exploring the practical steps that African governments, 53 of them, remember, need to do to make sure that this zero-tariff policy works.
A caveat to China's welcome tariff policy change is the reality that tariff alleviation doesn't equate to trade-related transformation. Essentially, a reduction in price only makes economic sense for African exporters if demand does grow and exporters here in Africa can actually meet that growing demand. And for that demand to go up, African countries have to produce these goods to at least Chinese market standards for this tariff change to have any meaningful large-scale impact. Let's now explore other key challenges that African stakeholders have to overcome. Poor logistics, ranging from inadequate ports to slow customs processes, could limit the ability to scale exports. A study by the African Development Bank found that Africa loses up to 40%, 4 out of every 10 tons of its agricultural output due to post-harvest losses and transport inefficiencies. Most African countries still rely on a narrow range of raw material exports in order to shift towards more industrial development, moving up the value chain, as it were. Authorities must invest in agro-processing zones, manufacturing hubs, and digital export tools. The agricultural industry is a cornerstone of the African economy. It employs 250 million Africans across the continent, and it makes up at least 35% of GDP. Data from the World Bank shows that agriculture accounts for 30 to 40% of Africa's GDP and employs anywhere between 60 to 70% of the labor force.
China's approach is increasingly in sync. It's in alignment with both the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area on one hand and the African Union's Agenda 2063 goals. By pivoting to this zero-tariff policy, China is essentially positioning itself as a reliable trading partner for multiple economies around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative is now over a decade old, and it's the centerpiece of China's outward economic engagement with especially economies in the global south. And it's meeting two things at the same time. On one hand, it's providing opportunities for Chinese firms outside the country, but at the same time, it's providing much needed infrastructure in participating countries.
China's economic relationship with Africa has expanded significantly since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. After becoming Africa's largest single trading partner in 2009, China's total trade with Africa rose from $198.5 billion in 2012 to $295.6 billion in 2024. In 2025, total trade between China and African economies went up again by 17.7% to $348.05 billion. That was primarily driven by 25.8% increase in exports from China, while imports from Africa went up by just 5.4%.
What will change if I'm exporting avocado, if I'm an Ethiopian farmer exporting coffee, if I'm a farmer in Senegal exporting peanuts into China? What changes from the 1st of May?
They have actually said they would help us with industrialization, where we begin to transition from just exporting raw materials to exporting agricultural processed goods to China.
So instead of exporting avocados, we export avocado oil?
We export avocado oil. And actually they are receiving some of the avocado oil. But most of the people who have avocado actually have no idea. They just want to send the avocado. So if we want to maximally utilize this policy, and it touches the people on the ground, because they have the technology, they have the machinery, and they want to work with us to process agricultural products for the market in China, we should now, in every county that has avocado, for example, have an incubator where they come process that into oil, package it, and ship it to China. The other important thing is the changes with respect to the financial policy. They are shifting from just infrastructure funding to now funding trade-related issues, meaning that even that conversion of our raw materials into products for export, it would be easier to access the Chinese financing. Thirdly, we don't have to struggle now and look for dollars to deal with China. China says you can deal with the yuan and the shilling. That changes things very
So there is an incentive there for our banks, our large Pan-African banks, to essentially connect to the China interbank payment system as fast as possible.
Exactly. That is what they are saying. And I call this the geopolitical dividends in the sense that the current friction between U.S. and most countries has made some countries to begin to look at how do we delink ourselves from, say, the financial infrastructure that the U.S. built, which is actually a monopoly. Everybody, if you need to send money to Uganda, it has to go to New York and come to Uganda.
That's through the SWIFT system.
The SWIFT system. It was the only financial infrastructure that facilitated trade. And if China is beginning to build a system also that is good, because we're talking about now we have other players, meaning that the cost might end up being lower than it has been.
What about, we might drop the price barrier, right, in terms of manufactured goods, in terms of agricultural produce or input materials, iron ore, and so on and so forth. But there's obviously going to be things that we have to meet in terms of market standards for the Chinese market.
Exactly.
Right? Sanitary and phytosanitary standards. That's going to be the big bottleneck that needs to be solved, isn't it?
No, and that's why they want to deal with Asia. What we do, especially with Europe on SPS, is that sometimes things land in Europe and they are rejected on the basis of failing the compliance of the SPS requirement. The Chinese are saying we will do the processing here for China, meaning if they don't require, if the material don't meet the SPS standards, then you minimize the cost of flying it all the way to China, and then Chinese people rejecting it.
In terms of how this is being structured, because the zero-tariff policy is essentially unilateral policy from the Chinese side.
From the Chinese.
And we've seen some countries negotiate bilateral pacts. Kenya has, South Africa certainly done that. What else do governments on the continent need to do to make the most of this trade deal, to essentially consolidate it into something that works for both sides?
Well, the first thing we need to do is to maximally take advantage of this, meaning that from day one, when this was announced, we should actually be looking at specific areas and how we can help people to work, get expertise and the machinery, maybe from China because it's affordable, and be ready for that. What happens is that it takes so long for ordinary people in my village to know that there is such an advantage for coffee, because coffee works through the cooperatives, tea works through the cooperatives. We don't know how much benefit would come out of that relationship, because also we have not streamlined on how cooperatives can work with the people out there. That's why you have been seeing a lot of coffee now is being exported by individuals, because the cooperative movement died. But you need that capacity to be able to meet the demands of China.
What should governments here be doing to, for lack of a better word, make their economies investor ready for the potential capital and tech and skills transfer that might be coming in from Chinese firms?
We need we need to sensitize our people. We have a lot of resources within our country, but our investment is very poor. A lot of money is in dead capital. If you look at the number of shops built in rural areas which are never used throughout their entire life, that is dead capital. We need to educate. Part of the program we must have in schools is how to invest and in what instruments we invest.
That brings us to the end of this special program exploring the potential and promise of China's zero-tariff policy towards 53 African economies. It's been clear in the making of this particular program that this policy removes a significant price barrier for producers, manufacturers and exporters here in Africa into the Chinese market. In the final analysis, though, the question will always be asked, how do we judge the success of a policy of this sort? Here are three ways of thinking about it. The success of the zero-tariff policy will be measured by the number of standards that are met by producers and exporters here, the number of factories built, but just as important, the number of livelihoods transformed. I'm Ramanyang. Thanks for watching.